and quiet. I feel like we should sing Kumbaya or something. But instead, we'll just get our meeting started. We are going, I'm chairing today for a minute. Charlie is has some family things to take care of, and so does James. Although Mr. Johnston is sitting in for Mr. Rogers. We are going, our order of agenda is all sorts of different than what it's agended as. So we're going to start with item number 6, which is the ordinance for a proposal for consolidated reporting. And Jennifer's going to kind of give us an update on that. You can stay here. You don't have to go to the table.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So council members, you may remember this. You first discussed this as a concept in early April. And at the time, we kind of identified the various subject areas that we could put in an ordinance, all of the very many information requests that the council regularly requests of the administration in order to fulfill your policy duties in the different areas you have. And so as a staff, we got together and brainstormed the kinds of things so that the administration would have a sense of predictability about the kinds of information you guys need on a regular basis to execute, you know, whatever duties you have related to policy in that particular area. Because there are so many areas of policy that you guys deal with, we decided to just kind of take a small chunk first and start with the area of budget. So the ordinance that's attached to the staff report goes through all of the various regular information requests that you guys typically need or would like to have during your budget deliberations in order to execute that function. And so that's sort of generally how it's organized. We also, because this is the first time you're adopting it, we authored the purpose statement, but it's just a draft, so feel free to suggest any edits if you have any changes to that. The administration did give council staff some feedback today on some concern about one is just a minor edit. I think that is totally fine in terms of clarifying whether it's a bid proposal or a request for proposal. And I think their suggested language is probably more accurate, so we'll probably make that adjustment. There's another section where they're concerned about wanting to make sure that the council stays within the lane of legislative functions and the administration stays within the lane of administrative functions. And so I think we just need to clarify the purpose of why you guys are asking for a particular piece of information. And we'll have that follow-up conversation with the administration. I don't know, sorry, did you want to speak more to it?
Did you have more?
Nope.
So I just wanted to reach out and say that I'm a little... The feedback that came back from the administration came back at 12:30-ish probably today, because we were in a meeting. And I feel a little frustrated with that because it's right before we are talking about it here, and the feedback says that they would want some clarification on things, which is fine. I'm always happy. I think we're all always happy to clarify. It's just frustrating because I think this could have been clarified, within the last 2 months that this has been out with the administration. So feel a little frustrated there. That said, one of the things that came up was the list of vacant city employee positions and the length of time the positions have been vacant. And it seemed, from my understanding of the feedback, is that this, and this is just for council members' knowledge, is that felt like maybe we were moving too far into the administration and wanted some clarification on why or how this deals with the executive legislative duties of this body. And I think, for my opinion of this, is that, we ask for this this type of information all of the time. What it helps us do, again, in my opinion, is make sure that we're not wasting money, right? I mean, that's kind of what this body is in part meant to do, is make sure that we're being responsible and spending taxpayer dollars. And if we have a vacancy for 2 years, I think we should be able to understand why it's vacant, what that position is, and how much money we're spending on it. So do we need that position anymore? Do we need to put that money elsewhere? So I think those are all policy questions that do very much relate to our role as the executive branch and what we do in a legislative manner. So that's for administration's clarification as they asked for it. That in my opinion, that's sort of the intent behind asking for those vacancies and why. Certainly, I'm not asking, I don't think any of us are asking to do the interviews or pick the person or be the manager of that person, which certainly is administrative. It's more, how are we making sure we're being fiscally responsible? And I think that's one way of doing that. Yeah, Erin.
I think in addition to that, that as we're looking for policy updates, new ordinance requests, that the capacity of any department to be able to do that just based off of the personnel time, but also under what leadership are these policies being developed or refined and executed ultimately by us. So I think it's irrelevant. It is relevant to both our budget and our policy-making capacity.
Well, and I think, Cindy, thank you, Erin. Something Cindy brought up, and I think is a good point that I didn't think of, is when there's a vacancy, I mean, just by design, that means, or potentially means, that we have a lower service to our residents because something's not being filled or somebody's taking on too much or something, right? And so I think it is our responsibility to understand how that vacancy or what that position is what is it doing or not doing for our residents?
Service levels.
And our service levels, yeah.
So I think we can safely follow up with the administration based on that input. That's helpful to clarify intent, make sure that it sticks within our lane of legislative of the legislative function. But I know it's a lot to go through, but please do give staff any feedback you have. We weren't planning on going line by line in this briefing, so unless you have specific questions on specific language, we'll probably just schedule it for either a follow-up discussion or individual small group meetings, and then consider adopting. Yep. And I think Erin has one.
Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The one I wondered if you could go a little bit deeper on, Jennifer, is the communication from city boards section. Particularly, and if you want to refer me to, I guess there's not lines.
Will you tell me where you're at, Erin? Sorry.
So if you're looking at the staff memo, you're looking at the staff memo, I think?
I was in the ordinance, but I'm up in the staff memo now.
We decided not to do, let's see, I'm just making sure.
I'm looking at
that
the
it didn't
bottom
end
of
up in there.
page 2, kind of.
The staff memo,
Yeah.
right? So that was actually from our discussion in April, where we were talking about the different segments of information that you guys might deal with. So that'll actually be a follow-up ordinance.
Okay.
So right now, if you look at that list of things, we are really only dealing with the budget and finance reports.
Oh.
So all of those other things will come in follow-up ordinances in the next, in the coming months, basically.
Okay.
So we kind of took small bites so that we could digest it rather than try to go through.
Thanks.
But the purpose of the communication from city boards is just to codify that boards can communicate with both branches.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Andrew?
I'm assuming that finance had a chance to weigh on this through the administration, and the time frames are okay with May being it's a good term for it. Not a deadline, but an expectation that
Yeah.
at that point we'd have a report.
Yes.
And that's been vetted, and we feel comfortable with that.
Yep, they looked
Mary
at
Beth
it.
is shaking her head, yes.
Truthfully, most of this, the list really originated from the 7,000 emails that our staff sends to Mary Beth's staff in the first couple weeks of May. And so the hope is that if we have this list ahead of time, that people can sort of plan it into their workloads instead of getting sort of one-off requests. So.
Mary Beth, you can come up if you want to add some more to that.
The other thing that I wanted to add is this last fiscal year, during the budget season, we gave a lot of this information to you prior to. We asked the council to come up with specific questions, council staff, so that we could give you that information prior to us giving you the budget, so that it made it easier for you. So I'm completely fine. I mean, some of the things are going to take us a little bit of time, but,
Right.
we'll go forward with it, yeah.
And I think the intention is for this to, have edits made to it as we discover if things do or don't work, right? So the point, it's a starting point based on what we usually need.
And it seemed to me from the discussions I remember is that we kind of just wanted to, as sort of has been the theme of the budget this year, is streamline the process. So every department sort of has its expectation and understands, so that when we get to those 3-4 weeks of budget season, we are better prepared, I would say, because we already have those reports and can sort of know if the funding is matching what the priorities are and all of that. That's what I remember kind of stemming out of these discussions.
Well, it's easier for us, right?
Right.
Because the expectation is set, and some of this stuff we can start accumulating prior to April, and then we can move it along. So it's easier for my staff of 3, which is small, right, and myself, to get all of this information together. If we have the expectation is set up front,
Right.
then it's easier for us to provide that to you.
Yeah, Andrew?
No, I agree. I just want to make sure we vetted, and because once we write it down, when all of us are gone, the context and the expectation versus the deadline will be lost perhaps within the whatever wording we have here. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page, so that when it comes up next year, for instance, we treat it as an expectation and not necessarily a deadline that gets us in a gridlock. This should be towards a more streamlined way of communicating versus setting up more barriers where we start to have oppositional stances based on a deadline.
Right.
Okay.
Did anyone else have anything? One thing I would ask, if I may, Patrick, the feedback we got from the attorney's office was sort of this feedback of whether or not we were if we were kind of overstepping into administrative bounds, if you will, and kind of, as Jen put it, making sure we're staying in our lane, and we do want to make sure we stay in our lane. It was a 2-sentence-ish email, and I was wondering if maybe we could perhaps ask for a little bit more detail on what Lynn feels is sort of the expectations of those lanes, so that we can make this policy decision within our own lane. Does that make sense? Just maybe a little bit more detail on what he meant with his concerns, rather than just kind of a quick couple-line email, which I appreciate it getting back to us so we could have this discussion, but when we come up with follow-up discussions, maybe we can have a little bit more info from him. Thank you.
And that's it.
That's it for that. Number 2 is actually going to be number 3, which is the Transportation Choice Fund's interlocal agreement with Salt Lake County. And just in time, because John just entered the room. So if we can have John Larson and Russell Weeks to the table, please.
So, Madam Chair, this is the final briefing of a series of 5 contracts that are going to have a fairly significant impact on Salt Lake City in the future. And I would like to draw your attention to the questions that staff provided, but I want to turn it over to John to see, for the bulk of the conversation.
Hi. So if I can just jump in. All right. So there are five grants. So when we've talked about these before. So this is just finalizing, getting your approval for the administration to enter into 5 interlocal agreements with the county, one for each of the grants. So I'll take this chance. Phone, got some notes here. Just for a quick update on where we're at on each one of these. So Life on State, which is, we got money for design and capital. So this is from 6th South and then going at least to, starting at 6th South, going south, at least to 8th South and hopefully 9th South. So the RFP is, we've been we have a draft that we've been circulating within the city and to our UDOT partners, and so that's going to be on the street soon for design. So probably about a year at least of design, hopefully construction in 2021. Yes.
Go ahead, please.
John, as you go through the projects, maybe you could hit on the policy questions, because I was going to ask what kind of public outreach happens with each of the studies.
Oh, sure.
And that first broad question of what do you expect what do you expect our residents to see as a completion of these 3 or the 5 total funds?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just say, broadly for all 5 of these, we're expecting, these are transformative projects, really. And so we're expecting considerable public engagement, especially with the residents and businesses along the corridor, but recognizing these are all corridors that impact more than just the people in the direct vicinity. And so the outreach would be broader than that. But, with special attention given to those along the corridor. We've already been working on State Street with our economic development folks. There's the new Midtown district, and so we've been coordinating with them. It's been a little bit quiet just because we've been kind of ramping up this, this next phase, but we've been able to get some fantastic feedback and input from the businesses along the corridor. So that project will be really looking at the pedestrian realm and helping to create a place that is comfortable and safe and really a place instead of just a pass-through to downtown, but really recognizing that you're already in the city once you've arrived to that location.
Can you tell me the boundaries of that State Street project again?
About 6 south to as far south as 9th south for now. And hopefully it's wildly successful and we can continue. I'm sorry.
Can we make it only 4 lanes when we are doing this? No, you don't want us?
I would love to. Yeah, UDOT's made it clear that that's a non-starter for them. One thing that we have talked about with UDOT is that normally they like forcing the buses to have to pull out of traffic and then back in. The bus drivers hate that because they pull out and then they can never get back in. And so we're actually in the redesign, tentatively, we're looking at pulling the curb line in all the way up to the edge of that outside lane, so the buses would actually just stop in the lane. So eventually, as we run more and more bus service on State Street, the outside lane would become basically a de facto bus lane, as people would just learn to, just to avoid it. And that's something that, I don't know, it's the little wins that you you take.
And how much was that grant for?
It was, it's in the notes.
Hang on.
I know
It was one of the bigger ones.
Sorry, one other question. You said this,
No,
but I
you're
was
okay.
getting my notepad out.
That's, Madam Chair, that's $2.8 million.
And is that design and implementation?
Design and construct mobility and safety improvements on State Street.
Perfect.
Yeah, so we'll stretch those dollars as far as we can.
John,
there we
can I ask
go.
a question on the State Street one while you're there?
Yeah.
You talked about the de facto bus lane potentially, or some other design elements. How much is UTA being involved in your discussions at this point, or will they be?
Yeah, they've been heavily involved, and one of the things that we had a working group spring of 2018 where we had folks from Salt Lake City and UDOT and UTA, and I think even some WFRC folks got involved to try and make some progress and get some agreement on what the concept would be moving forward. And that's where those discussions is where we came to the concept of putting mid-block bus stations along with mid-block like signalized crossings. And so that's something UDOT has already actually studied and approved and is paying for, a mid-block crossing between 6th and 7th South. We're anticipating doing another one between 7th and 8th once the development is ready for it.
Is this a
So-
starting point for evaluating the whole corridor from, say, 4th clear to 17th or 21st? Or is this isolated, do you think?
We're calling this a catalytic site. So the intent would be that this can show what can be done, and
Okay.
that we'll kind of be able to expand from there. As part of the grant, and I think one of the things that helped us get the grant, besides the fact that it's just a great project, we also partnered with South Salt Lake, so they're doing a 2 to 3 block catalytic site as well near their burgeoning town center south of 21st South. So I think the idea is that we'll get 2 nodes and then start working on connecting them.
Okay. Well, I asked that because the 200 bus that runs on State Street stops at almost every single stop. I mean, it's heavily used.
Right.
It's also heavily used by folks with disabilities and other mobility issues. And so it becomes a bus that's a frequent bus, but it stops so frequently that it doesn't get there very quickly, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I'm not saying it's a problem. It's just sort of understanding that dynamic on that bus particularly has a certain clientele that needs certain things. And the parking, the bus lane, and bus stops every block are helpful, and it's a complex sort of way. So I'm just intrigued to see what the priorities will be, starting with this 2 to 3 block area, and how that translates to the rest of that section of that State Street piece. So I'd be intrigued to hear that as we go forward.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, south of 9th South, we'd probably go from every block to maybe every other block. Of course, the blocks also get huge. You have some sections where it's half a mile between major cross streets, right? So those are all things that would probably be evaluated in the future, but that we would be sensitive to that context. So,
Okay.
but
Yeah, and I'd recommend as much as possible upgrading the bus stops as well.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
a heavy corridor.
Yeah, that's a big
yeah.
part of the plan.
Okay.
And that's where, as we've talked about, having these mid-block signalized crosswalks, that you'd have the enhanced bus stops just on the far side of those crosswalks. So what we've seen is that people, not just bus riders, but others, because the blocks are so wide or so long, that they're having to go all the way to the next signalized crossing. So a lot of people just jaywalk, and so the idea, right? And so the idea is that if you put the bus stop and the crosswalk together, that it makes it easier to get off the bus and cross the street to your destination, and do so safely. So the next project is almost $1 million for a multimodal circulation plan, and so this is one that's high priority for Mill Creek, but I think it could be a really big benefit for Salt Lake City as well. So they've had interest in extending streetcar down to, so it'd go to Brickyard and their new city center area, and that's the better thing, rather than saying we want to just extend the streetcar, as you pull back and say, well, let's do an analysis of, an alternatives analysis, that you start mode neutral and look at what destinations you want to connect to, and then figure out the best alignment, and then figure out the best mode. And that's something that is going to be done in a very highly collaborative fashion, a lot of community engagement. And then also would involve very high level involvement from both cities. Holiday actually jumped in, so I think probably as maybe a future consideration analysis of potentially even extending all the way down something, especially if it's a bus mode, extending all the way to the old Cottonwood Mall site potentially, which is anything that we can do to help get people out of their cars along that corridor is a good thing. So that will be considerable amount of work to pull that project off.
Sorry
then-
to
oh,
interrupt
go
real
ahead,
quick,
yeah.
John. The council and our council staffs have worked really hard recently with Mill Creek, and so anything we can do to make sure that public engagement on both sides, we're happy to help out with that,
Okay.
just through the discussions we've had recently that culminated sort of today. But also, I'm really excited about this project because I have a bet with Danny on what the study's going to say, and I think I'm going to win. So I can't wait to see what the study says.
Great. This is one we just barely assigned a project manager, and let me just pull back for a second and just say thank you for approving the allocation of additional staff. We're in the process of staffing up. We hired Kyle Cook, who is a very well-respected traffic engineer in the industry, who we were actually able to lure him away from the private sector to come work here. And it's these sorts of projects that we're attracting some great people right now. And so we're still scoping the work, and we'll actually split it into two sub-projects, one that will focus just on the transit analysis, and then the other one will be an update to the Sugar House circulation study to make sure that people can walk and bike comfortably to the transit.
And how long do you think it will take to get the study done? I mean, I know you're just now getting started, but what would be, how many?
I think realistically, we could have a consultant on board by the end of the year, and then you're probably looking at a 12-month study from there.
Okay, good to know.
And that will inform, besides just the transit portion, but the circulation study will inform some of the bond projects and street reconstruction projects that are planned for the Sugar House area, like 21st South, 11th East. 9th East is moving ahead already. We didn't have time to wait for this study, but hopefully we'll be able to make sure that that's coordinated. And then on all of these studies, we anticipate considerable public outreach and feedback. And so this has been kind of our crunch year, and as far as being able to get out ahead of projects, to be able to do proper engagement and conceptual engineering and design and planning prior to the civil design. And so basically from here on out, we have the time to really do it how we should, to avoid
Speed bumps?
speed bumps. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
John, forgive me if you already said this, but how does the RDA intersect with the 9th South design and construction as it relates to the two project areas?
Yeah, I hadn't gotten to that one yet, but we can do that one next. So we had $4.3 million from the county grant for to throw into that project, which is also we have utility money. We have the RDA section, and then we have the street bond to actually rebuild 9th South. So the RDA is the way that's working is that we'll do the design for the entire corridor, recognizing that they have a chunk right in the middle.
Wait, the RDA will design?
No, there's a whole 9th South project team internal to the city that has now been formed that will look at the complete redesign of 9th South from 6th West all the way up to Lincoln Street.
And so, just to clarify, so is the RDA portion of 300 West to West Temple part of
yes.
that? Okay.
Yeah.
Until we finish the State Street portion. Bam. Then you got another chunk.
Yeah, and we are. Thank you. And the RDA has also
Any day
been.
now,
I
any
should.
day.
They've been heavily involved in the discussions on the Life on State implementation, and they're also jumping to. So 9th South, we actually have the design consultant selected, and are just in negotiations, finalizing the contract. And so the design will start on that very soon, and that will have considerable public outreach, including a very open, transparent process about parking impacts.
When do you anticipate the public outreach part to begin?
Almost as soon as we get a consultant on board.
When is
We'll start.
that?
As soon as we can get the contract finalized, which should be this month, so by the end of this month.
Oh, great.
So
Okay.
we're talking
So this autumn.
later this fall. Yeah,
Okay.
we should start
Great.
rolling out some
Yeah, quick
robust
question.
public involvement.
Quick question on the 9th South one. It starts from 6th West and it goes east. And
Right.
we've already done essentially other side of the train tracks going west. Any discussion about how we bridge that over the train tracks there? Will this talk about that as preliminarily sort of how we would start that process, or is it really going to be siloed to 6 West going east, and then we'll have to deal with that at some point or other?
Yeah, well, the getting over the tracks, that will absolutely be part of this conversation, but I think for now it's going to have to be just doing the best we can with at-grade solutions. So like Z gates, where it forces people to kind of zigzag to force people to look both ways for the trains as they go through. Like that sort of thing is probably what we're looking at for now. And then in the future, I'd love to look at options that would include like a bike ped bridge or things like that. But that's going to have to be a future phase, I think.
Okay. Can I ask a question going back to the Sugar House multimodal transit discussion? So the money came from the county, $942,000 and change.
Yeah.
Is that sufficient for the entire study you're thinking at this point? Or are there going to be other funding has to be added into this?
I think that's enough to do an alternatives analysis and the circulation study. If you're looking at some major capital investment that would involve big environmental impacts, we would have to get additional money because now you're talking in the millions.
So how's since it's county money, I'm assuming the work product would need to be expected to be shared across all 4 jurisdictions.
Right.
So is it open and collaborative that way? Everyone will have access to this and buy in, and so no one has a problem later on with the results of it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Okay.
It'd be similar to what's happening on the Davis SLC connector transit study, where you usually have your policy committee, which is elected officials, and you have your technical advisory committee, which is the staff. So we would probably set it up very similar to that.
So since it's a Salt Lake City grant, I guess, we would have oversight over the grant itself. Will other cities have any similar oversight from their legislative bodies or their government?
That would be through the policy committee.
Yeah.
So, we're doing the biggest lift on this, and someone had to lead it, and
Yeah.
we're probably the best position to do that. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't include them in a
So when you say a policy committee, it's elected officials from multiple jurisdictions together?
right. Yeah.
Okay.
So usually from the administration, and then usually people from council as well.
Okay.
So once we get up and going, then those invitations can be extended. So
Jen McGrath is running to the table.
here comes Jen.
Sorry,
Yeah, I didn't
if I may.
misspeak.
No, not at all. No, I just wanted to add to what John was saying, that we anticipate that the alternatives analysis will result in a locally preferred alternative, which will be both an alignment and a mode of transportation. It would be incumbent upon each of those jurisdictions to adopt that LPA,
yes.
should they choose to do so. So they'll be involved in the process as we work through the study. And then once we have the results of that, they and you would be in a position to determine whether or not you wanted to adopt that locally preferred alternative.
Okay.
That help?
Yes, thank you.
And in past projects I've seen, the project doesn't go forward unless every city on the alignment adopts the LPA, or the locally preferred alternative.
Which is the
So-
benefit of keeping everyone involved from the very beginning. They also they contributed to sort of the scoping, originally the bare bones scoping that led to our application for the grant fund. So they've been involved from the beginning.
So moving on, the other two projects were we have a West Side Intermodal Hub. So this is at kind of the Redwood Road, North Temple area. We're still working on a temporary solution so that we can, as we talked earlier this year about the issue with the Route 9 was originally planned to end at the North Temple Redwood area. We thought we'd be able to squeeze something in quickly at the Rocky Mountain Power site. We ran into contaminated soil issues. So right now it's ending at the Maverick on 4th South and Redwood. So this study would be looking at more of a long-term solution in that area for an intermodal hub. And we'd want something that is a true amenity and not just a place for buses to circle around and for drivers to have their break between runs. On this and also the East Side hub somewhere on 2nd South, which is the other study, that's something that we're working very closely with the RDA on so that it's something that is, at the end of the day, is something that people say, like, wow, this is great, and we're so glad that this is in our community, that it's a true amenity.
Is there anything like that in the UTA system that you could point us to?
No.
Oh.
Not even close.
We'll be the first. We'll be the first and the second.
I'll be honest. It's, we have some derogatory names that we give for some of the hubs that are out there, and I think we can do a lot better.
We can
Go
talk
ahead.
about that
Why don't you just
offline.
let us know? When we went to Boulder years ago, in these kind of early explorations of what is now our ILA with UTA, they have in downtown Boulder a pretty amazing intermodal hub and indoor bike storage system. And I'll just get on my soapbox one more time here and say it's so helpful when we do city explorations together to look at the way things actually play out and what the contracts look like and be able to talk to both sides and say, how would you do it different today? So there's one more thing, show us on some trip. I'm sure there's other.
There are a lot of examples.
Not just an intermodal hub, but
Nashville has a great one.
Yeah, so does Chicago. I mean, there are a lot of examples of great mobility hubs around the country and around the world, and we want to try to emulate that here, but make it better.
And as we look for those kind of travel opportunities, none of them really seem to be cropping up from the administration. If it's not the next, I mean, we've been asking for an RDA trip for a long, okay, Amy, hold on. But I'm saying, so Downtown Alliance is going to announce their next city exploration, if they haven't already, but that's coming up. Wherever that is, maybe there's some good stuff we could go see there. Maybe it's an NLC, but let's find some way for us to get out together and look at a lot of stuff we want to see.
So if I may, Madam Chair, this is just a heads up on both those studies. It appears to staff that if one goes ahead with those projects, it's going to require a zoning text amendment for both areas, because the way I read the planning, the zoning code, that bus lines, stations, and terminals are permitted uses in commercial corridors and general commercial areas. Neither of those locations have that zoning. And so the balancing test for the council is going to be installing two high impact, regionally significant projects with what the zoning allows, and in neighborhoods where particularly on 2nd East or 2nd South, which is zoned largely for multifamily housing.
For the West Side Hub, there's two different versions. One is a long-term, bigger plan. One is the immediate plan, hopefully in the next 6 months. This is going to encapsulate both of those, even if they're divergent or different fundamentally. I can see if they're the same, sort of the immediate thing leads into the bigger thing in the same location or a similar thing. If they don't, is this sufficient to do both?
We envision this study really focusing on the longer term solution. short term, we really just need a place for the buses to turn around and a restroom for the drivers.
So that'll happen regardless of the short-term one.
Yeah.
Okay.
But longer term, as we roll out the two new Rose Park routes that are planned, and then you have the 5600 West BRT project that will be coming down this corridor, we really need to have a really high quality, truly multimodal center for the transfers between those routes and the tracks and the Redwood Road route.
Okay.
This probably goes without saying, but those, I wouldn't envision that those two locations, those sites would be the same. Well, they will be context sensitive. That's their separate studies. We'll look at each place individually so that we're sensitive to what is around those and what the needs are. The needs will be different on Second South than they will be on Redwood and North Temple. So I would envision them potentially being very different from one another, but both being something that we haven't seen yet,
In a good
not
way.
just in Salt Lake City, but in Utah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And the Second South, or the East Downtown Intermodal Hub, we're wrapping that into a broader study to actually look at turning Second South into much more of a, like, doubling down on that as a transit corridor. I don't know if transit mall is the right term, but and that we actually have the scope is ready to, or we're close to having an RFP on the street to be able to select the consultant to help with that. So that's one that hopefully by the end of the year we'll have someone under contract and rolling, and then by fall of 2020 have recommendations. So Second South is on the streets bond list, and so that's partly what's driving the timing on that one, that we're really hustling to get that one up and going.
Perfect.
So we'll be able to hopefully have some recommendations for the East Downtown Hub somewhere between State Street and 7th East, and then some recommendations for Second South to really make that just an incredible place for transit, make it, like a place as far as, placemaking and urban design, and then also just improve the overall safety and walkability along that corridor.
Awesome. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add? I do want to say real quick, and I've said it before, but I have to say it again. Awesome work on getting these grants. I mean, that's a ton of money, and I know
Don's team.
I know how quick the turnaround was. I know how hard you guys all worked to make sure we got those. These projects are so cool, and it's great to get money from the county anytime we can.
Big thanks to Mary Beth's team, too. They always help us with grants. They're wonderful to work with, and without them, we would not be nearly as
finance team?
successful as we have been.
Thank
So
you, finance
it takes
team back there,
takes a
too.
village.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate all of the hard work. One thing I was hoping for, I was thinking about this while you were talking, after the county interlocal is done and signed and the checks are ready to be mailed, maybe it would be helpful if, to kind of some of the points that were brought up about community engagement, if we could have just a one sheet bullet point of these projects, one to tout all of the good work that you did. I think it kind of gives a little praise to the county, like supporting our cities, but then we can all put that in our emails and newsletters and stuff, and then it starts to be on the radar of the community members to say, I'm going to be interested in that when that comes up, and then hopefully community members will continue to be engaged in looking at when those outreaches are, and not just throw the postcard away, but actually read it and see what date they should go engage with us and have that conversation. So I think if we could have later, and I'm sure, and one of our staff, Russell, you can work with Russell to kind of put a little
Project one-pager.
Yep, just a bulleted quick, here's what it is, look forward to community engagement for each of us.
And just to clarify, the final vote will be the scheduled vote will be for the 17th.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John.
One last thing.
Sure.
I forgot to mention on the Life on State. We did peel off some money just for design, not for construction yet, to look at 2nd East and Main Street to do high quality, high comfort bike facilities there in coordination with South Salt Lake. Just recognizing that just the realities of dealing with the state route, we can't do what we would do on a city street, but we own 2nd and Main, and so we can really make those hopefully really sing as great regional bike connectors.
Because of the two
have money for
catalytic
that.
sites, we have the opportunity to really make those connections between essentially the southern border of our city and the northern border of South Salt Lake, all the way into downtown for multimodal transportation.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okey doke. Number 3 is number 2, which is our budget amendment, number 1. So I see Ben Ludke and Mary Beth Thompson and John Vike coming to the table. Do we still have a quorum? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you're fine.
This is the first budget amendment of fiscal year 20, and this is the first briefing. The public hearing is scheduled for September 17th and a potential vote on October 1st. I sound sick, but I am no longer sick. That's why I'm here.
Sound great, Ben. You sound great.
There are 4 adjustments requested by the administration. They total just over $3.8 million for all the items in the budget amendment, of which $323,290 is proposed to come from the general fund's fund balance. An update on fund balance, it currently is estimated at 13.07%. This is $231,000 above the 13% minimum threshold. And just a reminder that this does reflect the increased minimum threshold the council established in the annual budget, moving it from 10% up to 13%. You'll also notice that the fund balance projections table in the administration's transmittal reflects this 13% new minimum. It is too early in the fiscal year to have updates on revenues. That'll be included in the next budget amendment. An update on impact fees. I've got a table to put on the big screen. The numbers have been updated since what was included in the transmittal, since the council added additional parks and streets impact fees to CIP, and the budget amendment transmittal was received before you adopted CIP. So these reflect your votes in the CIP budget. And just a reminder, in budget amendment number 6 of last fiscal year, the council fully funded updating the impact fee facilities plan. The results of that are not expected until probably winter at the soonest. The first item is a request for $113,290 from the fund balance, and this is for 2 separate items. The first item is $35,000 for security improvements at 4 businesses adjacent to the Paramount Homeless Resource Center. These were previously discussed during the annual budget, and they were going to come from CAN's existing budget last fiscal year. However, they were unable to get it under contract by the end of the fiscal year, so the $35,000 drops to fund balance. This would be approving the $35,000 for those improvements. The second item is 6 months of funding for the hand director. During the annual budget, the council captured those vacancy savings for 6 months. Shortly after the new fiscal year started, that position was filled, and this would be restoring the funding for that position. The next item is a potential property purchase, and there's not much information since as a property purchase, it would best be discussed in a closed session. But what is public is it's a request for $3 million of parks impact fees and $1 million from the stormwater riparian fund and public utilities. And just a staff note, the surplus land fund, which could also be used for property purchase, has a balance of $1.1 million. Item A3 is a request for $110,000.
Are we,
Madam Chair,
yeah. If it's specific to that particular question, we can answer more questions in a closed session that we're having later.
from a recent past public meeting when we were talking about keeping that surplus balance, the 1.1 that you mentioned, that came up recently, didn't it?
In CIP.
And there was a minimum-ish or a time in which it takes us to regain. And we had decided on that one to leave that 1.1 intact, if I remember right.
So the discussion, as I remember it, was there is a ongoing expense of property maintenance. So each year, the Community and Neighborhoods Department takes about $200,000 from that account for various, it depends what's happening to the properties, so the expense fluctuates each year, but the revenues into the account are one time because it's funded by sales of property, which also fluctuate year to year.
Okay.
Madam, would this be an okay time, Madam Chair, to jump to that part of the budget amendment then, Ben?
Yes, so there is a...
That has to do with the surplus lands account, some changes in that?
Yes, so that is item I2, and it is a draft legislative intent, which I'll put up on the big screen. So in fiscal year 19, there was previously a second ongoing property expense that was also funded out of the surplus land fund. And this was a full-time employee who worked in the Community and Neighborhoods Department doing property management. And what the council did is say, this is one-time revenue for an ongoing expense. You typically try to avoid that situation because you can set up structural deficits. And so the council took that position out of the surplus land fund and added it into the base budget for the Community and Neighborhoods Department. The draft legislative intent is proposing to do the same approach, but with the ongoing property expenses. It reads, the council expresses the intent to fund ongoing property maintenance expenses out of the Public Services Department and/or Community and Neighborhoods Department fiscal year 2021 budget, rather than continuing to use one-time revenues from the surplus land fund. The council requests the administration include this approach in the mayor's recommended budget for fiscal year 2021. This approach builds upon the council's fiscal year 19 decision to shift funding for a CIP-related FTE away from the surplus land fund and into CAN's base budget.
So, Benny, could you help me understand, on average over the last several years, how much money has been used out of the surplus land account for maintenance? Do you have that number anywhere?
I don't have it, but we can request it from the administration.
I'm just getting a sense, because we're not adding more money into their base budget at CAN. We're just saying pay more.
It would be adding money into their base budget. I think that would be the only
Surplus?
way. No, not out of surplus land. I think
Somewhere else we have to find it.
right.
Yeah.
General fund would probably
Right.
end up adding that into
Somewhere,
either
right?
CAN or Public Services budget. It hasn't been to the amount of the 200,000. We haven't exceeded that or come back for a budget amendment, but we can get you a 5-year historical on the utilities and the maintenance.
Okay.
We can do that for you.
Yeah, we could get an exact number. My understanding is that it's consistently been right around $200,000, just under $200,000 consistently for the last several years.
Okay. Just gives me a sort of threshold worth talking about. Okay. Thank you.
And that would be just known sort of ongoing maintenance things. It would not account for, say, for example, things like water park. Say if you were to have a fire at
Or
one of our
two.
properties. Things like that that come up that are unanticipated are not things that are contemplated in that amount.
Anybody else on that item? Okay, back to A3.
Jumping back to A3. This is a request for $110,000 from the general fund balance. The intent is to move to a contract approach to better provide full staffing of crossing guards. The contract is expected to cover 2 years of service. Crossing guards currently work 1 hour twice per day at a rate of $13 an hour. The Parking Enforcement Division is going to be moving to a new shift schedule. The intent is to focus on the higher demand for parking during the afternoons. The benefit is this could improve the turnover of parking times as well as increase revenue. One of the downsides is parking enforcement officers also cover for crossing guards when they are unavailable for their shift for whatever reason. But since they're shifting to focus on the afternoons, there'll be fewer on-duty parking enforcement officers available to cover for crossing guards in the morning if they're unavailable. The administration put out an RFP on the contract for the crossing guards, and the selected bid had a significantly lower cost per crossing than the city. The administration provided a table, which I'm putting up on the big screen, which shows that the annual cost for each crossing is $11,725. And this includes indirect and direct costs. So the largest item by far is the first one, which is the expenses for the wages of the crossing guards. And then the next largest is the indirect cost of citations that are not written revenue the city does not collect, which is estimated at $214,000. And then there are materials and supplies, $33,000. Administrative support, $45,000, and then there are also HR costs. These are city employees. They do go through the city's existing systems and orientations and trainings, and that's $65,000. So the total cost is $902,809. There are 77 crossings in the city. Of these, 8 are optional. The other 69 are required by state rules. So the estimated average cost, $11,725. Now, the bid that was selected from April, it had a cost estimate of $7,660 per crossing, and it would pay $1 more per hour, which would be $14 per hour for the crossing guards. So this is $4,000 less per crossing, and it would pay $1 more per hour, which is expected to help with retention and staffing. If the council were to fund the request, it would have to go back through RFP because it has been longer than was originally contemplated. So the cost could increase, but the estimate right now is $110,000.
Questions?
Do we have a list of the required versus non-required crossings, and if they'd cover? I've got technically 5 elementary schools in my district. I don't know how many of those would actually get covered by this. Do you have a list of that anywhere we could look at?
We can request the list of locations. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, the concern has been, say, Franklin Elementary, which had a big problem last year on 3rd South, may not be a required crossing, therefore wouldn't be covered by this. So it would actually mitigate when the problem's over there.
We'll request the list, and the criteria as set by state code is pretty technical.
Yeah.
It was 100+ pages, which is why it's not attached to the staff report. But if it would be helpful, we could ask the administration to prepare a summary of what makes a location required or not.
Yeah, it'd be good to have the actual crossings, particularly for elementary schools, available so we would know what we're talking about, the impact on the neighborhoods, and if we need to do some adjustment on that from a city end of things.
If there are no other questions, I'll go on to A3 or A4. This is a request for $100,000, also from the general fund's fund balance. In 2015, the city entered into a contract with the property owner of the Dunkin' Donuts property, the one at 400 South, 200 East. And the agreement was to pay $150,000 upfront to terminate a billboard lease, along with an additional $100,000 payment later if the billboard was not relocated within 36 months somewhere else on the 400 South corridor. The billboard has not been relocated at this time, hence the request for the $100,000 payment. Because this is a contract, it would probably be best to have questions and answers in a closed session. I believe the attorney's office is prepared for that later today.
Great.
Those are all of the administration items. There are a few more council-added items I'll go through. Item I1 is a follow-up from the council's July 16th action when you approved an interlocal agreement to implement the Transit Master Plan's frequent transit network in the city, part of the Funding Our Future initiative. The final estimated budget was almost $1 million less than what was originally included in the annual budget. At the time, the council asked staff to bring this up in the next budget amendment to put the funding into a holding account and hold a discussion about how else these funds could be used for transit-related uses. But the council wanted to wait for the results of the branding study and the Fair Pass analysis study, so those results could inform what the options would be. So this would be the formal step of just putting those funds into the holding account, pending receipt of those study results.
Questions?
We already talked about I-2. I-3, this is a follow-up from the fiscal year 20 CIP budget. These are the street impact fees, $281,690, as well as the parks impact fees, just over $1.1 million that was added into the CIP budget above what was originally identified in the annual budget. So this is the formal step of authorizing those funds for the projects you identified. And there are several projects which are pending the council action to release these funds, and those are listed in the staff report. The next item is I-4, and this is related to the increased fund balance policy that the council established in the annual budget. In looking back on the previous 10%, it was established through several council actions, including a legislative intent, a resolution, your budgetary actions, as well as the mayor's recommended budget. So staff drafted a legislative intent to help put in writing that this is the city's established policy. In case anyone asks or would like to see something written down, this is something we could point to. The draft intent reads, the council expresses the intent to maintain a fund balance at least equal to or greater than 13% of the annual general fund budget. We recognize the importance of maintaining a healthy fund balance level to support AAA bond ratings, which result in lower borrowing costs for taxpayers, meet fiscal requirements under state law, and provide necessary funding to respond to emergencies. I'm seeing nods and smiles. The last item in the budget amendment is I-5, and this is also a follow-up from CIP. Some council members expressed interest to increase the percent for art, which is currently set by ordinance at 1%, to increase it to 1.5%. This would require $36,883 to do so for this fiscal year, and this would only be a one-time increase to 1.5%, absent an ordinance amendment to require the higher level. Otherwise, the ordinance only requires the 1% each year. There is currently no ongoing funding for maintenance of the city's public artworks. There's estimated to be 150. There's probably more, and the collection is expected to continue increasing. There was a 2013 appraisal report of art in this building, the city and county building. I think it also included Plaza 349. It estimated the total replacement value of the 111 works it looked at $3.4 million. And of particular note, the May We Have Peace sculpture outside in the Washington Square Park of the Native American holding up a peace pipe is estimated at $1.75 million, and it's likely the most expensive piece of public art that the city owns.
Can I ask a question on that? I remember this sort of coming up during CIP, but I think given that there is no art maintenance funding, and the policy question is, do we as a council want to request the attorney's office to prepare an ordinance amendment increasing the ongoing percent? I would like to have a policy discussion about putting that 0.5, if we are going to increase it, then dedicating that 0.5% to maintenance. And sure.
I wonder.
Charlie's back, so he's now the chairperson again.
I don't know.
Sure.
He's eating a cracker.
I'm eating a celery.
I think I would support that, but I would want to know from our arts director how they see the ratio of budget needs, or I don't know what the need is there.
Sure. I mean, and that's fine. I think that sort of this, it says, you know, we did an appraisal in 2013, so it would be nice to see that, and then maybe that policy discussion is saying we want to dedicate a percentage of this increased percentage to maintenance, whatever that looks like. So I would agree. I would just ask perhaps the chairperson if maybe we can come back to this at a future date. I'm fine with this budget amendment for this year, but before we increase it permanently, I think it's important, as we've been discussing since I've been on the council, the role of maintenance in the city and how we fund that maintenance, that if we're going to increase it, which I think is great, I love public art, we need to maintain it and figure out the best way to do that.
Councilmember Fowler, Councilmember Johnston.
Is there anything in the ordinance now that would prohibit the Arts Board from using it for maintenance? Any of the 1% or?
I would have to double check. It's attachment 1, but I think it specifically says to include art features in capital projects.
Yeah.
So that would seem to preclude
maintenance from.
Yeah.
Okay. So simply giving them money and having them decide for themselves wouldn't make it work that way. We have to change the ordinance.
If I could chime in, I think we also have a little bit of a challenge because you have one group that's charged with creating art, and that's the art board.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have another group that maintains city facilities, and that's public services, and they're in different departments. And so sometimes there's a disconnect of, you know, maybe art is installed along a trail, and then that trail is maintained by public services, and no one, you know, owns the maintenance of the art. Is that the art board who's not in the business of maintenance typically, or is that the people who are in the business of maintenance? So maybe we need to circle back with the administration and get some more information on where that would be appropriate to even locate those funds.
I would encourage that, and I second Councilmember Fowler's statement earlier about visiting that piece. I don't know how broad we want to make this, but it seems like it would need to go there, what you're talking about who takes ownership for it once it's created. And some art may not be maintained. It may be transitional. So I would support this particular amendment, but looking forward to that, to a statutory change, having that discussion.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
I don't remember if any of you, my peers, were at the meeting that was put together with many of the arts advocacy groups and Arts Council about a year ago, and part of my desire to work with Councilmember Johnston on this increase was out of that conversation, which was really the need for more arts investment in the city, period. And the theme of maintenance didn't come up. And that's why I would just like to check in with the Arts Council folks before we restrict funds. And I hear that we're going to do that, but I wanted to say that the sentiments I've heard over the years from the arts community was not so much about the need for more maintenance of existing.
Thank you, Councilmember Mendenhall. So I'm supportive of the of this piece in the budget amendment, but before we change the ordinance, I also would like to talk more about, you know, how to allocate that extra 0.5%. And while, you know, I understand that, you know, the arts community may not have brought up the maintenance piece, I mean, we really haven't had to use it yet. A lot of the art that we have, especially the public art outside, is newer, and so, or it's being maintained, you know, on the city's dime. So I think having a more proactive plan and a maintenance fund, so that when there are problems with some of these art pieces, should a problem arise, we have a fund ready to go to continue that maintenance. Because just, you know, adding new pieces and letting, you know, the existing art run into disrepair wouldn't be responsible either. So, but for this one, you know, let's go ahead. I'm fully supportive moving forward, adding the 1.5% this year. But before I would support an ordinance change, I just want to see how exactly that would work.
The last thing I'll say is on the RDA side, the board has also had discussions about how to fund some of the RDA's owned public art. And so there's the city side and the RDA side that this issue impacts.
Thank you.
And that's the last item in the budget amendment. The
Okay.
public hearing is September 17th with a potential vote on October 1st.
Great. Question or any additional comments about the budget amendment? Okay. We will now take well, let's see. I'm going to look to Patrick. So we are ahead of schedule right now. We do have funding our future housing follow-up. How long would it take your housing folks to be ready to present? I know Lainey's here, or not presenting, just more of the follow. You're here? Okay. So so let's do this. Instead of taking a 35-minute break, because we do have a time certain item at 4 o'clock, let's go ahead and jump ahead on our agenda to that funding our future housing follow-up discussion. And let me pull this up. Okay, so Allison Rowland is our council policy analyst. Allison, if you want to kind of lead us off on this, and then Jennifer McGrath, the CAN interim deputy director, and Lanny Eggertson-Goff, and Jen Schumann, or no, just you guys. Okay. Thank you. Well, not just you guys.
We're juggling multiple meetings. We're dividing and conquering today.
Okay. So Allison, turn the time over to
So
you.
this meeting is a follow-up from the discussion last week on the Funding Our Future housing programs that the council put into a holding account during the budget discussion. It's about $1.775 million total. And I guess the question for today is whether the council wants to discuss these items or any of the programs in particular, or go ahead and get ready to adopt the current ordinance that we have in draft form.
Thank you. So we did have quite a bit of discussion about this last week, and I just wanted to make sure before we move forward that, we have an opportunity, if any of you have any follow-up questions about this item, and if you don't, then
I have one
that is fine too. Jennifer.
Just procedurally, it is on your formal agenda for adoption tonight. The Attorney's Office prepared an ordinance that would effectively release these funds. You don't have to take action tonight if you don't feel ready, but that's kind of the purpose of this conversation, is just checking in, making sure that that's okay.
Does anyone have any issues with taking action tonight?
If I could just add, both CAN and HAND have offered to meet with any council members who would like to get together in small group meetings if you have specific questions about particular programs, either in addition or either now or later, whenever people are available.
I personally feel good about where our discussion was last week, but I just want to make sure that everyone else is comfortable as well before we just move forward. It seems to me that everyone is comfortable moving forward, so thank you for your willingness to answer questions, and we'll take action on this item tonight.
Great.
Thank you very much.
All right. So now, instead of a 35-minute break, we will have a 33-minute break, and we'll come back at 4 o'clock. So thank you. work session. The next item on our agenda is a resolution between Salt Lake City and Mill Creek City on a proposed boundary adjustment and interlocal agreement. Earlier this morning, Amy Fowler, myself, represented the city council. Mayor Biskupski was there, and then Mayor Silvestrini and representatives from his city council. And we stood together in a press conference and announced that we have reached an agreement between both cities after several months of long meetings, really good negotiations. And that's what we will be talking about in this interlocal agreement. Jennifer Bruno is our Council Office Deputy Director. Sam Owen is our Council Office Policy Analyst. Sam will walk us through the interlocal and talk about some of the specifics of this of the agreement. But before we do that, I just want to acknowledge the work of council staff, the administrative staff, and council members, from our city, as well as our corresponding representatives in Mill Creek. As is with any negotiation, there are ups and downs. Things started off, fairly rough, but what we've been able to do, I think, is a perfect example of how local government works best, and why it's important for the legislature in particular to allow municipalities to work through their issues. I can speak for myself, but I also feel safe speaking for Mayor Silvestrini that the sense that I had during the negotiation is that all of the comments, all of the work that was done, both cities did what they felt was in the best interest of their residents. That was the paramount concern that all of us shared. And I think because of that concern, because of that focus on our residents and what the best, what was in the long-term best interests of our respective cities, that is why we were able to come together with this agreement and the interlocal. So, Sam, I will turn the time over to you to walk us through some of the specifics, and then council members, if you have questions, chime in.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You actually covered most of it.
Well, then there we go.
That's it. That's all there is. So the negotiations between the elected officials over the last several months addressed a couple of boundary adjustment proposals. This is the first one, or this is a rendering of the first map. What you see here is 13th East, where it becomes Richmond Street. Highland Drive is the other border, and then you've got Woodland Avenue and Miller Avenue. This boundary adjustment includes a number of commercial properties that would be part of Mill Creek as part of the proposal. They're currently part of Salt Lake City. These are the only tax-generating properties that are part of the two separate boundary adjustments. They collectively generate about $61,000 a year in combined property and sales tax. As compensation for the properties becoming part of Mill Creek, Salt Lake City would receive about $610,000 over the next 10 or so years per the terms of the interlocal agreement. The other parcel that's proposed for boundary adjustment is this roundabout at 23rd East and 27th South. It's currently in Salt Lake City. It's actually a UDOT property. Mill Creek has asked that it be adjusted into their city so they can landscape the roundabout, beautify the area to make kind of a gateway to Mill Creek, which they don't currently have the jurisdiction to do without the adjustment. So those are the two properties. Like I said, the interlocal provides for Salt Lake City to be compensated the tax revenue, the revenue generating properties for about 10 years. there's language in the interlocal as well as in a resolution that would be adopted that's scheduled for action by this city council in about 2 weeks. There's language in both of those documents that covers the city's mutual commitment not to approach the state legislature not to approach the state legislature as a first means of resolving any disputes that arise between the two cities in the future. And that covers most of it. In terms of the logistics, the resolution that the council would adopt in 2 weeks here would initiate the boundary adjustment process between the two cities. That starts a 2-month period during which there cannot be a public hearing. So there's like a 2-month noticing period at the end of which a public hearing takes place. The council receives any comment and then takes action on an ordinance that would potentially adopt the boundary adjustment between the two cities. There are some administrative steps that come after that, and the boundary adjustment becomes effective. In this case, on the timeline that we're on now, the boundary adjustment would become effective July 1st, 2020, depending on.
Right. Jennifer?
Just one other thing that was touched on earlier, but maybe not expounded upon, is that one of the other benefits of the last few months of the elected officials and the staffs working together has been that staff at Mill Creek and staff in Salt Lake City have realized where there might be common sort of areas of coordination. And so even though the boundaries might not be adjusted, there's ways that, speaking to the earlier conversation about the planning of the extension of the Sugar House streetcar line, like doing some of those sort of coordinated cross-jurisdictional planning efforts. And so I think those are ongoing and will continue past when the council adopts this resolution. I think the assumption is that that will continue forward. So anyway.
Thank you. And I think one other very important point is the Brickyard Shopping Center will remain in Salt Lake City in perpetuity, and that was also part of this agreement with both cities. So for Salt Lake City, I think that's very important. What we will do though is, we've talked about having our planning office and Mill Creek's planning office work together as Mill Creek moves forward on their city center, so that any planning efforts, any potential CRA in the Brickyard there would be a joint planning effort there, so that the end product of development actually that it will be consistent and uniform. You're not going to see one city building a 20-story tower on its property at the expense of the others. So that ongoing collaboration, in my opinion, is one of the best outcomes that we could have imagined last year. So anyway, questions or comments from the council?
Can I?
Councilmember
Jump
Fowler.
Quick. I want to acknowledge Mayor Silvestrini and council members Jackson and Dwight. Dwight, I don't know why your last name just slipped my mind, but and thank you for being here. But I wanted to kind of piggyback off something that Charlie said, and when we began these negotiations, these discussions, I'll say. It was emotional, and there was a lot of high emotion happening and a lot of potential contention and sort of pushback. And I really want to thank Mill Creek City and the mayor for sitting down and have with us, me and James and Charlie, and having those tough conversations and really kind of getting out on the table what we were all feeling and why we were where we were at, and then kind of setting any of that tension aside and saying, okay, now let's roll up our sleeves and get to work together and see how we can make this actually happen. I think it went from maybe, and I will say this just from me, maybe some snarky comments here and there to really having a working relationship and a collaborative relationship. And I think it really just goes to show what Charlie said about local politics and that we all care about our neighborhoods and about our communities so much, and I think that's where that emotion and that passion comes from, is just we care about our communities and we want the best for them, and we get protective of them, I think. And I have really grown to appreciate the dialogues and the jokes and the new friendships I think we've gained out of this, and want to thank you all for always sitting at the table and having those hard conversations with us so that we could come to this agreement. And we said it this morning in the press conference, but hopefully be examples of what other cities, neighboring cities, should be with one another, that we're all in this together somehow, and it's everybody's community. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
Councilmember Johnston?
Yeah, I have just a question on the, we call it the hatchet. I don't know what we're calling it. The hatchet. Has outreach been done to the commercial property owners? What's the feedback at this point?
Yeah, I can talk about that, and I know Mayor Silvestrini will also talk about that. I'll let Mayor Silvestrini talk about that.
We can wait for a second if you have something else first.
Okay.
Okay.
Councilmember Valdemoros.
Question for the compensation that Salt Lake City will be receiving for this portion, we're counting these properties and then the ones from the roundabout as well?
The roundabout, thank you. The roundabout is not a tax generating property because it's owned by the State Department of Transportation.
Great.
So just these parcels.
So it's just this one.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
Can you talk to us about the history of tax revenue on this section of properties, and how it seems like is the 61,000, what's that based upon, and what kind of history went into the projection of the 10-year revenue stream?
The 61,000 is based on the most recent year for which full receipts are available. I believe that's fiscal year 2018. In terms of the history, how that stacks up, I don't know the answer to that question. We can check with finance and find out what that line looks like. And then in terms of a projection, I also don't know. I can ask finance.
But it was mutually agreed upon to take
Mutually agreed upon by
the
both
last
cities
full year of tax
during the
receipts.
exactly. Yep.
Okay.
So the middle building right there is the Comcast facility, and this question was posed at the press conference about whether what kind of revenue is generated from that. We do not receive any revenue from Comcast billings, so there was the assumption was that there was more money there than there actually is, and so this mainly is just the property tax. The sales tax would be from the piece to the left on the chart, and then there's the strip mall that includes Kathmandu, the restaurant, and there's a soccer shop and some other stuff. The lactation station as well. So, those are the commercial properties on those parcels. Councilmember Johnston.
Just one more question on the roundabout. The Parley's Trail now will bisect both communities in a pretty short amount of time. Is there who does the maintenance on that at this point? Going forward after this, does it change at all?
I don't know the answer to them, and I'll check. I know that that section of the trail is currently within Salt Lake City. My understanding is that maybe Jennifer Bruno can help us.
I think because it's a county trail, the county has actually been maintaining it, even though a segment of it is in the city. We could double check and make sure, but and then the road sections would still be UDOT.
UDOT.
Yeah.
But the county does maintain them, I'm guessing, at this point, so it wouldn't change much.
They maintain the eastern section of it, so it would surprise me if they stopped in just that piece. But we'll confirm. We'll check and see.
Okay, it may be part of the interlocal agreement if the county needs to work with Mill Creek on a separate agreement. Okay.
Any other questions or comments? There was a question also earlier about the squaring up of the boundaries. I know that was an issue for a while. The working group that negotiated this, we felt that it was important not to impact residential properties. That's where a lot of the pushback was when we had these discussions early on. Mill Creek residents like being in Mill Creek. Salt Lake City residents like being in Salt Lake City. And, the collective feeling was that if we started adjusting those boundaries, this process would have become much, much more complicated. And so while we still have the unsquare boundary issue, that is we've dealt with that for 40 plus years. So, and we can still, if residents, want to do something else and look at annexing or squaring up the boundaries, they can do that. But, our feeling was it was we wanted to deal with the immediate issues first, and for Salt Lake it was having some resolution on the Brickyard, and for Mill Creek it was having resolution and being able to move forward with their city center plan. Councilmember Wharton.
Yeah, you said that I think at the press conference talking about the representative who was sponsoring the bill withdrawing that.
Yes.
Were they a part of these negotiations as well?
They have been Representative Potter, Val Potter from North Logan, was so when he agreed to abandon his bill, after a meeting with Council Member Jackson, Mayor Silvestrini, myself, and Councilmember Rogers, to let us come up with a local solution. He has been apprised. We've kept him in the loop as to things moving forward, and the plan is for Mayor Silvestrini and myself to visit him in North Logan and present this. Not present him the option, but let him know that the agreement has been reached.
Yeah, I'm sure
You're all welcome.
A very pressing issue.
As long as there's only 3, or we'd have to publicly notice it.
Right. I'm sure it's a super pressing issue for North Logan, but the reason why I ask is because I'm hoping that the legislators who were maybe wanted to be involved in this are also comfortable with this deal, and that they're and it sounds like they are, that they're going to have the understanding that this resolves the issue, and there won't be the need for any for them to bring any other legislation that might, disrupt the agreement.
Yeah, I would never guess, or I would never venture to guess that the legislature would be comfortable with anything that we come up with. But what I will say is that the request that was made by both cities to let us work on a solution, we have done that. And I think having both cities, able and willing to stand together, if there is another push, to say, look, we asked to let us resolve this. We have resolved it. So thank you for your interest.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Mayor Silvestrini, if you want to join us at the table. Typically, we don't have comment in a work session, but this is a extraordinary circumstance, and it made sense to invite Mayor Silvestrini to talk about things from his perspective. So, Mayor, thank you for being here.
So, thank you, Council Chair Luke, and I appreciate the courtesy of breaking the rules and speaking at your work meeting. But I think it's an important watershed event for our cities, and there are a few words I'd like to say. First of all, I'd like to echo the remarks that Council Chair Luke made and Councilwoman Fowler made. We had really great collaboration. I want to include Councilmember Rogers in that as well, because he was part of that on his team. I want to thank Sherry Jackson on our Mill Creek Council and Dwight Marchant, who's also Council District 1. Their districts kind of cover this area, but at least Sherry was with us as well, and the description. I would also echo the description of those negotiations. As you know, they began out in maybe not the way we would like them to have begun, but I have to say that I don't know if it was the league convention or all kinds of things, but I really feel that we made a lot of progress, and frankly, I think we came away from this whole process as friends and respecting each other as colleagues in neighboring cities. I'm very happy with the result that we were able to achieve through these negotiations, and I am really the best thing about it really is the tone of collaboration that we've established for the future with respect to this area and everything else, not only along our northern boundary, which we share, but also I think there are things that we can do collaboratively in the legislature and on other issues that we share. Mill Creek residents are very similar to Salt Lake residents, and we share concerns about, growth, congestion, air quality, affordable housing, transit, you name it. So I think that we can be solid partners on that, and I think this is a good start for that. The other thing that I want to just say, and I will take credit for drafting the language that went into the interlocal agreement on this, but what we are agreeing in this interlocal is consideration for this boundary adjustment. Mill Creek is swearing off the Brickyard forever, and we will stand by that commitment, and if it's necessary, we'll go to the legislature and say no. Okay, so you have our commitment on that, and I've also agreed to go on a road trip to see Representative Potter or whoever else we have to see on this. And the only other things I want to say is that is thank you for this, because I've told the story before, but our residents identified this area as a town center. It actually makes sense as a town center because it's centrally located in Mill Creek, and it's an area, especially on our side of 13th East, that needs to be rejuvenated. It needs a facelift, and this boundary adjustment will enable us to accomplish that much easier, so we're not dealing with two sets of zoning and two planning commissions and two city administrations. We'll do it coherently. And the other thing I'm looking forward to is working with you all to basically plan this whole area, because someday the 1970s era Brickyard Shopping Center is going to need the same kind of, or some kind of treatment. And, to plan this area jointly in a way that makes sense for both, residents of Mill Creek and Salt Lake City, so that it works together as a unit, so we're not stepping on each other or duplicating each other, I think is a marvelous way for cities to behave. So thank you for that. And thank you also for the roundabout. So it doesn't generate any revenue. It's UDOT property, but it will enable us to, it's been a source of complaints that I get all the time about. The weeds grow up and they don't get taken care of. I know there's been an irrigation system put in, but then it was ruined when the Parley's Trail got built, I guess. So it will enable us to take ownership of that figuratively, not literally, and to landscape that and make it be a gateway for our city. And that also will, Salt Lake City residents exit that ramp and go in that way too, so it'll be better for everybody that way. And we will commit to do whatever's necessary to maintain the Parley's Trail. That's a treasure for us as well. That's the way I can commute around, and so we're partners in all that. That outdoor recreation and trail stuff, we're just solidly behind that. So, and I think I always thought that was county maintained, but to the extent it's not, we'll step up on that. The other issue that is covered in the interlocal that is important is, Salt Lake City has water infrastructure that goes through that property, and we will execute whatever easements or whatever to protect those interests. Your water system is our water system, so we have a solid interest in protecting all that as well. So I don't know if you have any questions or anything, but I just want to say thank you very much, and I think this is a great day for both of our cities.
Thank you, Mayor Silvestrini. Sorry, Councilmember Mendenhall, and then.
Well, Andrew's question about his original question about property owners.
Oh, yeah.
I can address that.
If you could address that, and then Councilmember Mendenhall.
Yeah, so I believe there are actually 5 property owners in this area, and I know that three of them have responded favorably to the idea. They're going to probably see a little bit of a reduction in taxes, and then there are 2 residential properties there that we we haven't had any communication with in some time, but, and we sent letters out on this because we wanted to make sure that it was, okay with them. We haven't heard any objection. So obviously, that's kind of what the public hearing on this is all about, to give them an opportunity to be heard. The one thing I can say, if I can, just in terms of process, so as I understand it, this is your briefing. Mill Creek will have what we call a first read on September 9th, which is our next council meeting. I understand that it comes back to your agenda on the 17th for consideration of adoption of the resolution in the interlocal. We see it on the 23rd of September. Then we have the 60-day period for the public hearing, which for you will be on November, I can't remember if it's the 19th or the 17th. I can't read my own writing. And ours is on the 25th of November. And then we'll consider final adoption on December 9th, and I think you get it on the 3rd of December. So that's the time frame, and that's mandated by state law that requires that 60-day notice before a public hearing.
Great.
So,
thank you, Mayor.
I have 3 questions for you, and I'm going to ask them all at once. I want to know if it's legally binding in the ILA that you're going on the road trip. I want to know if there's going to be a joint statue of the council members who participated from both sides mounted in the middle of the roundabout. And if so, I want to be on the jury of who selects the artist for that one. And then I want to know if you're going to take advantage of that new state law that allows the contemplation of tolls on state roads. I think it was meant for the Central Wasatch Commission, but this could be a revenue-generating possibility for you. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a possibility.
So I don't think it's legally binding, but it's morally binding that I go to Logan, North Logan, okay? And I'm doing that on the public record here. In terms of the legislators, I guess it probably depends on who you get. Some of them we might voluntarily go, but don't know about that. And then in terms of tolling,
no, it's the statues. The statue is the other one.
Yeah, that
I think you've got a couple council members.
We have
got
a quorum here, and we noticed this as a public meeting for Mill Creek, so we could probably vote right now, but not likely we're going to see tolling there. Although, as a member of the Central Wasatch Commission, that is something we do have an issue to solve with respect to traffic there, and while tolling isn't popular, it has been a marvelous thing in Mill Creek Canyon. It has enabled the improvement of infrastructure in that canyon. It's a nominal toll. I want to preserve access to the canyons, and I don't want to do anything that restricts that, particularly with respect to it being affordable. But I also know that we need to be creative about how we're going to solve some of the problems that we have up there to protect the watershed, protect the recreational asset, and protect it from all the loving it's getting, and also make it so that I can go skiing without having to wait for 2 hours at the bottom of the canyon. So does that help you?
Yeah, as long as you're not putting the toll right here on the roundabout, too.
I doubt that's going to happen.
Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, just one more thing. So earlier in our work session, we got an update on our transportation grants that we received from the county. And it just reminds me of this collaboration that we received the grant to do the study regarding the expansion or another
circulation plan.
Circulation study for mass transportation, and I really look forward to seeing how that study comes out, and I think it will really play into how we're kind of building up that area right there, and it's exciting that we're here at the table now, and we get to come back hopefully in about a year and a half and see what we're going to do then. And so, again, just that these are the types of connections we want to make sure we're having. So that way we all get money from the county. And that's really the goal.
Yeah,
right?
and I completely agree with that. And, we supported that grant because it benefits both of us. And I know that Jen has been working on that, on an RFP for the consultant. Our staff has been involved in that as well. I'm excited about that. I think there's a lot of possibilities for linking Sugar House and our town center in some way. It needs to be done. Wasatch 2050 says nodes of density connected by transit. We're all over that. So,
great.
Thank you.
Mayor, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks a lot.
Council members, thank you for being here as well. And then, as was discussed, we are set to hear this in our formal meeting and take action on the 17th. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next item is an ordinance regarding an alley closure at approximately 1000 South between 800 West and Jeremy Street. Its reference is Meade Avenue, but the city recognizes it as an alley rather than a street. So Brian Fulmer is our council policy analyst, has been working on this. David Gellner is the principal planner on this project, and then Nick Norris is our planning director.
Good afternoon. As you mentioned, it's an alley closure proposal for what is known as Mead Avenue, but actually is an alley. It runs east and west. As you can see in the slide on the screen, the yellow highlighted portion is the subject alley. There is also an intersecting alley in blue that is not part of this proposal. If the subject alley is closed, the other one would be dead-ended at this point until something else happens with that alley, if anything. The Planning Commission followed planning staff's recommendation to forward a negative recommendation to the council. And I might note that the applicant is in the audience as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, and the entire alley, there is an alley that runs between 800 West and 900 West, but because it's bisected by Jeremy Street, we considered this to be a whole alley, i.e. between 800 West and Jeremy, and then from Jeremy to 900 West would be a separate alley, so it wasn't just a segment of the alley. As Brian mentioned, it was referred to as a street. It was platted in 1890 as part of a subdivision called Albert Place, and it looked like it had been intended to be a street between that and an adjacent subdivision to the south, platted in 1888, but it eventually just became an alley on city records. The petitioner actually lives in the south of the alley, so he's in the Muscatine subdivision. The property disposition, if the alley were vacated, would have to go to the north subdivision, which it was platted with, so the petitioner himself couldn't get the property. It would, or not conveyed by the city, he could have a private agreement with the adjacent owners. We looked at this under the four policy considerations for an alley vacation. For processing purposes, and it was what the applicant submitted, the public safety, that it was a nuisance contributing to that. So it did seem to meet that policy consideration, at least for processing. But then looking at the factors, the 8 factors that go into analyzing the vacation, the reports from the Salt Lake City Police Department indicated that while there were a number of activities reported, they didn't describe any of them as alarming. So that is how we came to the negative recommendation, that looking at those factors more closely, it didn't seem to rise to warrant the vacation, and also the alley is still passable. It is definitely not in perfect shape, but it is passable and drivable, so.
Great. Questions about this issue? Councilmember Valdemoros.
Hey, David, what about the neighbors, the adjacent neighbors? I mean, you have a bunch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and maybe the rest of the neighborhood. Have you gotten a lot of comments about it, similar comments to the applicant, or?
No, but they all did sign the petition. There was all but one neighbor signed the petition, and they didn't indicate any dissent. They just didn't sign the petition, so.
Okay. Councilmember Johnston.
Can you explain the police department's position a little more concretely?
They just felt the type of crimes and things that were reported, they described it as non-alarming. They did acknowledge there were some crimes, but I couldn't explain it in more detail than that.
Do we have any other concerns about that being one of the recommendations? If our only way to do it is by police report, is it volume, is it content, is it both?
I think we rely on their judgment as to whether or not it's something of a serious nature.
And if the alley is contributing to the crime that's in the area, I think that was the distinction the police department made, was yes, there is some criminal activity, but it doesn't appear to be related to the alley.
I'll have to understand that at a different time, perhaps. So how do they deem it's not contributed by the alley versus something else? I guess I'm not following that, but that's a more detail on the police report.
Again, he described, the officer with the police department said that there was a fair amount of activity, but he just said that he didn't classify it as alarming, but I think from staff's perspective, we're not discounting that. There may be a public perception that it's a nuisance and contributing to crime, so.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the rationale you're taking on here. I think the seemingly unanimous agreement of the neighbors adjacent to that, and their perception is a major factor here. And I mean, I want to go off of data, and that's why I'm asking about the police stuff a little more, because it's hard to quantify that based on knowing we have lower levels of crime reported in this district versus other districts.
Right.
So the sheer volume itself, for me, wouldn't necessarily be the contributing factor to say it doesn't measure up, but.
Okay, other questions or comments? Councilmember Valdemar.
It's just as a refresher for me, David. So let's say this alley was vacated, and what happens to that alley? Are we going to fence it? Like, are the property owners that will get part of the alley to the north, I believe, will they close this alley and then we won't be accessible to the general public? Or I can't remember the details.
Typically, in this case, the disposition from the city would have to go to the property owners from the north, so it would be closed. They, of course, could split that with some of the property owners to the house. To the south, that would be a private transaction that the city isn't a part of. Typically, when an alley is vacated, it splits down the middle if it's equally between two subdivisions, which is not the case here.
And then this would be in the hands of the property owners at their own expense on how they maintain it, if they close it, if they leave it open for access?
Correct.
Okay.
It would become part of their property.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
You know how I feel about closure of alleyways. I think it's not often that the Planning Commission forwards us a completely unanimous negative recommendation. They often feel different than I do about alleyway closures. And so I want to say that is absolutely important to my consideration here. And that if we're citing public safety as the main concern, typically in other, especially in the Ballpark and Liberty Wells area where we have impassable alleyways, those become more likely spots for concentration of crime, or it's easier, frankly, if it isn't an easy pass through and it's a dead end alleyway situation. So I think am I hearing from you that the passability from 8th to 9th is basically the same for the alleyway as you go west of Jeremy?
West of Jeremy, it's a little bit more passable. It seems to be a little bit less potholed and a little bit better shape.
Mm-hmm. And is there any reason that the residents couldn't request of the streets to come through and do a pothole fill as they're able to? I know that residents in the Ballpark neighborhood and the Liberty Wells neighborhood make those requests, and as streets are able, they'll go through and fill potholes and do some really minor repairs.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Yep.
So I think I'm concerned that a closure of a portion of the alleyway and a dead end of the rest of the alleyway might relieve those immediately adjacent neighbors of crime or people loitering in the area. It might also increase or concentrate that same activity to their neighbors to the west. Did the Planning Commission talk about that?
No, they didn't. And one of the recommendations from staff was also looking at, with our new ADU ordinance and things like that, that alleyways, there may be future uses that haven't been explored at this point in time.
Councilmember Johnston.
I hear what Councilmember Mendenhall's saying. I also know that there's nobody who actually accesses the alleyway from their property. Nobody on Meade or on 8th or on Jeremy accesses the back of their property through either of those alleyways that I'm aware of. So functionally, they become just pass-throughs. They're not actually usable for the neighbors. The future may hold different ideas, but that's not necessarily the reality of this right now. And so cleaning up the alley to make it passable doesn't actually help those other neighbors necessarily. Which is why I think they're looking at the alley closure, because it's not being used as it is now, so it only attracts one thing.
Okay. So is the applicant here?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll grant the applicant 5 minutes to speak as to their interest. So if you could just come forward and then introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your application.
James Kiefert, live, like you said, on the south side, and Clint lives behind there. So again, we're the two that wouldn't receive any of the properties. So, I mean, this isn't like a selfish grab here. Just to kind of address the concerns that has been brought up by the commission, the planning commission, I'm kind of curious to know what alarming means, because, you know, a lot of us have kids there, and I walk up and down that. We see all manner of trash. We see drug needles often. I mean, that's kind of alarming for me. My fence has been ran into twice. When we're talking potholes, we're talking huge dips. This would be a huge undertaking for the city to repair it, let alone upkeep, the bushes, everything else along with the asphalt. So yeah, my fence has been smashed over. That's alarming to me. That's just my presentation. We have a couple of the other neighbors here too. All that signed, we're 100% on board. Everyone had a story, whether it was watching a car be driven in, completely chopped apart, like a chop shop, and gone before the police could get there. Again, alarming to me. We've had cocaine bags found. We've had toilet bowls left, people sleeping out there, coming out there late at night for what I'd consider probably sketchy drop-offs that are parked there for long durations, like 30 minutes at a time, just to drive off.
There's, I have a picture of some dude's butt from when there was people getting it on in the alley. Who wants their kid to walk out and see that? You know what I mean? So his fence is still down, and part of the only reason that alley is still passable is because your mirror can go over where his fence is down because of all the brush that is on the other side.
And I did want to address Aaron Mendenhall's concern about the, if I was understanding you right, correct me if I'm wrong, the blue alley there ending as a dead end and being another vagrant, possible dead spot. We did want to close that alley down. We actually tried to submit a request to close both of those down. We have pretty much all the neighbors on that side as well in agreement, but they told me you can just do the one, and I'd have to do a separate request. So figured I'd do the one first and then just go through the second, because the application fee is not cheap. The other problems that the city had was, the planning commission was the second alley, which we want to close too, and just the fact that it is, I don't know, it's alarming to us as far as safety concern. And you were absolutely right, Andrew. None of us have like a private access, so it wouldn't be blocking us at all. It is strictly a pass-through. In fact, none of us ever use it except for maybe to walk, which I have no problem. I mean, we're talking one house over and I'm to a full street, so it's not like it's inconveniencing passerbys in the slightest.
Yeah, there's a lot of the reason that where that does tee off, part of the reason that there wouldn't be as much criminal activity at that dead end is because there's no trees, there's no cover. The people's fences are more see-through, it's more well lit. Where we are, you can't even see the alley in the picture because of all the overgrowth. And that's why people stop there, because there's places to hide. There's places to hide things. That's the problem. There's none of that. Any time the city has come down and cleaned things up, they never touch any of that major overgrowth. And so that right there is the reason that people stop there.
We could go on, but I think our 5 minutes are up.
Yeah.
Questions for the
I do.
applicant?
So thanks for addressing that. I'm wondering about and one of you lives on Jeremy, I'm assuming? If
I do.
Okay. I wonder about the neighbors on Jeremy using either direction of Mead for getting in or out. So if it dead ends where you're applying for it too, I guess you're the only neighbor from Jeremy we could talk to.
Well, I can sort of speak on that because we've been gathering signatures for the blue alleyway closure there as well. So I can only speak for that half, that they're good for the blue and all of Mead Avenue being closed if it were up to them.
So that's another
that half.
pending application?
Yes.
The blue?
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as on Jeremy Street, the people that actually use that live on that side. Usually there's a guy that uses the gate access on the other side of Jeremy, from Ninth West, and he does
there's a
make a
gate?
circle through the, huh?
Sorry, where's the gate?
It's, so on the left side of Jeremy, just to the north, it's not where we want to close, it's on the other side.
Where Jeremy Street meets the other part of Mead Avenue that we're
9th.
not closing.
Yeah, and so.
There's a gate right there?
No,
It's
just
right here.
not on the alley itself, not blocking the alley.
Yeah, and so that guy uses that side to drive through, but the only reason he does that is because he has a bunch of stuff back there and he sells a lot of items. Everybody else that comes up Jeremy Street either lives there or just is there by accident. And when they look down both sides of the alley to go down it, they go, oh, well, which one's going to damage my car less? Because if you go down the other side, the bumps are even bigger. There's not as much overgrowth, but the bumps are even bigger. I don't even drive down it. I could go straight from my driveway out to 9th and go up to the grocery store, but I don't even go down, and I have a truck.
I never do either.
Because it is
Same thing.
so freaking bumpy. So.
Also, I like my fence.
So Brian, there's so many colors on this map, and what you were referring to is the blue T-bone, is that baby blue between 9th and Jeremy. So I hear that there's another pending application.
It's not submitted.
Okay.
We're waiting for this one to go through.
So then, Brian, am I assuming right that there's an alley on the equivalent, the red one, between
here?
Jeremy and 9th right there?
Yes, there is an alley there
Okay.
that tees with the extension of the Mead Avenue to the west, to 9th West.
Got you.
And there are houses on Jeremy Street on the west side that don't have a driveway access in front. And so they actually have to use the back access. That's the reason that the alley's there on that side. Ours is not like that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, other questions for the applicant? All right, thank you both.
Thank you.
So back to Brian, any further questions or comments about this application? Since it's not really an ordinance, since we don't have an ordinance written. Okay. All right, so we have it set, or on our consent agenda tonight. We'll be setting a public hearing date. Or no, the hearing date is tonight, so we will be hearing that in our formal meeting.
No, Mr. Chair, it is on tonight's consent agenda to set the
To
hearing
set the-
date
to- okay.
for October 15th.
Got it.
And then
Okay.
potential
'Cause,
action
yeah,
on
'cause I
November
didn't think
12th.
we were having public hearings tonight, so, great. So we will set that on the consent, or that's on the consent agenda, we'll do that, and then that'll be on October 15th. Great. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
That is the final item that we have on our work session, with the exception of a closed session. And so once we do the closed session, then we will reconvene in our formal meeting at 7 o'clock. So I didn't hear your question. Sure. Councilmember Fowler would like a short break before the closed session. So let's do this. If you would make a motion to go into closed session, and then we will have that break. Well, you need to make the motion and then, okay.
Mr. Chair, I would like to make a motion to go into a closed session for purposes of advice of counsel. And
property.
Potential
Purchase.
Yeah.
Purchase, exchange, lease of real property.
Yep. Okay, and Councilmember Johnston, do you still accept that as a second? Okay. Roll call this, Councilmember Valdemoros? Fowler? Mendenhall? Wharton? Johnston? I'm a yes. We are in closed session. We will be back across the hall for a formal meeting at 7 o'clock.